Karen thought she could do what no one else could: snap a selfie with the Royal Guard and get away with it. But one silent response shattered her pride and her phone. What unfolded wasn't just a reality check, it was a reminder that no one matches the discipline, restraint, and presence of the Royal Guard. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because unmatched honor is coming your way. London's morning mist clung to the imposing gates of Buckingham Palace like a shroud of ancient secrets. The cobblestones, worn smooth by millions of footsteps, gleamed with morning dew as tourists began their daily pilgrimage to witness one of Britain's most enduring traditions. Among the gathering crowd, camera phones glinted in the pale sunlight, each visitor hoping to capture that perfect shot of the legendary Royal Guards. It was on this particular Tuesday morning that Karen Whitmore stepped out of her luxury taxi, her designer heels clicking against the pavement with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life. At 43, Karen embodied everything stereotypical about the wealthy American tourist abroad. Her platinum blonde hair was perfectly styled, despite the early hour. Her Louis Vuitton handbag swung from her shoulder like a badge of superiority, and her eyes held that particular gleam of someone who believed the world existed solely for her entertainment. She had flown into London just yesterday on a first-class ticket, part of what she called her European conquest tours on social media. Her Instagram account, @KarenLarge, boasted 30,000 followers who hung on her every post about luxury hotels, expensive restaurants, and exotic locations. But today's post would be different. Today, she had something special planned. "Excuse me," she barked at a nearby tourist, a middle-aged man from Germany who was quietly reading his guidebook. "Take a picture of me with those guard guys, and make it good. I don't have time for amateurs." The man looked up, startled by her commanding tone, but before he could respond, Karen had already moved on, her attention fixed on the motionless figures standing at attention before the palace gates. The Royal Guard stood like statues carved from discipline itself. Their red tunics were immaculate, their black bearskin hats towering above the crowd, and their faces set in expressions of stone. These weren't merely ceremonial figures, they were active soldiers, trained professionals who took their duty seriously. The morning shift had begun only an hour ago, and already the guards had maintained their posts with unwavering dedication. Ignoring the constant stream of tourists, the flashing cameras, and the occasional inappropriate comment, Karen pushed through the crowd with the subtlety of a bulldozer, her elbows finding their way into ribs, and her voice cutting through the peaceful morning air like a rusty blade. "Move it, people. Some of us have important things to do." She clutched her phone, the latest iPhone Pro Max in rose gold, like a weapon of mass documentation. Her manicured fingers, adorned with rings that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, gripped the device with the intensity of someone preparing for battle. The barriers around the guards were clearly marked with signs in multiple languages: "Do not cross," "Maintain distance," "Royal Guards on duty." These warnings might as well have been written in invisible ink for all the attention Karen paid them. In her mind, rules were suggestions, and suggestions were for people who lacked her level of importance. She approached the nearest guard, a young man of perhaps 25, whose military bearing spoke of years of rigorous training. His name was James Morrison, though Karen would never bother to learn it. He had joined the army at 18, served 2 tours overseas, and considered his current position guarding the royal residence to be both an honor and a responsibility he took seriously. He had been standing at attention for exactly 4 minutes, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, his breathing controlled and steady. "Okay, soldier boy," Karen announced, as if she were a director calling action on a movie set. "I need you to look this way and smile. This is going on my Instagram, and I need it to be perfect." She raised her phone, angling it for what she considered the optimal selfie position. The morning sun caught the lens, creating a brief flare that caused several nearby tourists to shield their eyes. Guard Morrison didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge her existence in any way. His training had prepared him for this exact scenario. Tourists tried this nonsense dozens of times every day, and the protocol was clear: maintain position, maintain composure, maintain dignity. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled only by the distant sound of London traffic and the murmur of other tourists who were beginning to notice the brewing confrontation. Karen's perfectly applied makeup began to show the first signs of strain as her jaw tightened with frustration. She had expected immediate compliance. After all, wasn't that what service people were for? Back home in Beverly Hills, a single snap of her fingers could summon waiters, shop assistants, and valets. The concept that someone might simply ignore her was as foreign to her as quantum physics. "Hello," she called out, her voice rising several decibels above what any reasonable person would consider appropriate. "I'm talking to you. Don't you speak English?" She snapped her fingers inches from the guard's face, the sound sharp and insulting in the morning air. Several tourists turned to stare, some pulling out their own phones to capture what was rapidly becoming a spectacle. A British family nearby, parents with 2 young children, watched in growing horror as Karen's behavior escalated. The father, a London accountant named David, leaned down to whisper to his 7-year-old daughter Emma, who was tugging at his sleeve with increasing urgency. "Daddy," Emma whispered, her voice carrying the kind of innocent clarity that only children possess. "That lady is being very rude to the guard. Isn't she supposed to leave him alone?" "Yes, sweetheart," David replied, his voice tight with embarrassment for his fellow human being. "She's not supposed to do that at all." The crowd was growing, drawn by the magnetic pull of potential drama. A group of Japanese tourists positioned themselves for optimal viewing angles, their cameras ready. An elderly Italian couple shook their heads in disgust, muttering in their native language about American tourists and no respect. Even the street vendors, usually focused solely on hawking their wares, had stopped their sales pitches to observe the unfolding situation. Karen, oblivious to the growing audience, stepped closer to the guard. The barrier that separated tourists from the royal grounds might as well have been a suggestion line drawn in chalk. She crossed it without hesitation, her heels clicking on the ancient stones that had been walked upon by royalty for centuries. The guard's grip on his rifle tightened, almost imperceptibly, a trained response to a potential security threat approaching his position. The morning air seemed to thicken with tension as Karen violated every protocol, every boundary, every shred of common decency that governed behavior around the Royal Guards. She began circling Guard Morrison like a predator, her phone held high, taking photo after photo from different angles. The flash was on, creating bright bursts of light that reflected off his polished buttons and the gleaming barrel of his rifle. "Come on, work with me here," she cooed, as if she were photographing a fashion model rather than harassing a soldier on duty. "Just one little smile. It won't kill you." She moved to stand directly in front of him, blocking his line of sight, and forcing him to stare through her as if she were transparent. The discipline required to maintain his post while being actively harassed was immense. But Guard Morrison had trained for exactly these situations. Behind Karen, the crowd was growing restless. What had started as mild curiosity was rapidly turning into collective disapproval. A group of British university students began murmuring among themselves, their voices carrying across the courtyard. "Someone should stop her," whispered Sarah, a history major who had visited the palace countless times. "This is completely inappropriate." "Look at her," replied her friend Michael, shaking his head in disgust. "She acts like she owns the place." An American couple from Texas, Tom and Linda Henderson, watched with growing mortification. They had saved for 3 years to afford this trip to London, and seeing a fellow American behave so disgracefully made their stomachs turn. "That woman is embarrassing all of us," Linda whispered to her husband, her voice thick with shame. "Can't believe she's acting this way." Karen remained blissfully unaware of the growing hostility around her. In her mind, she was the star of her own show, and everyone else was simply background scenery. She had positioned herself for what she considered the perfect selfie angle when she noticed that Guard Morrison's hat was slightly crooked, at least. It appeared crooked from her perspective. "Hold still," she commanded, reaching up toward his bearskin hat. "Let me just fix this for you." The moment Karen's manicured fingers made contact with Guard Morrison's uniform, the entire dynamic shifted like a tectonic plate suddenly finding its breaking point. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to suck all other sound from the morning air. Even the pigeons that had been pecking at crumbs near the gates took flight. As if sensing the change in atmosphere, Guard Morrison's head turned toward Karen with mechanical precision, his eyes steel grey and utterly without warmth, locking onto hers with the intensity of a laser sight. The movement was so sudden, so decisive, that Karen actually stumbled backward, her confidence faltering for the first time since she had arrived at the palace. "Step back," the guard commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The words echoed off the palace walls, seeming to reverberate through the very stones themselves. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, delivered with the full weight of military training and royal protocol behind it. For a moment, just a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Karen might have actually learned something. Her eyes widened, her phone lowered slightly, and her mouth opened in what could have been the beginning of an apology. The crowd held its collective breath, hoping against hope that common sense might finally penetrate the fortress of entitlement that surrounded this woman like armor. But then Karen laughed. It wasn't a nervous giggle or an embarrassed chuckle. It was a full-throated, dismissive laugh that spoke of years of getting her way through sheer audacity and the power of her credit cards. She threw her head back, her perfectly styled hair catching the morning light, and laughed as if Guard Morrison had just told her the most amusing joke she had ever heard. "Oh, please," she said, waving her hand dismissively as if brushing away an annoying fly. "Don't be so dramatic. It's just a photo." She raised her phone again, this time moving even closer to the guard, her face positioned right next to his for the ultimate selfie. "Come on, tough guy. One little smile won't hurt. Your precious reputation." What happened next would be debated and analyzed on social media for weeks to come. Guard Morrison, his patience finally exhausted and his training kicking into high gear, made a movement so swift that many in the crowd barely saw it coming. His rifle, held at the ready position, came up and across in a controlled but decisive arc. The butt of the weapon connected with Karen's phone with surgical precision, sending the device flying from her hands in a glittering arc of shattered glass and bent metal. The iPhone, that rose gold symbol of her digital dominance, hit the ancient cobblestones with a sickening crunch that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. The screen spiderwebbed into 1,000 fragments, the camera lens popped out like a displaced eye, and the rose gold casing split open to reveal the delicate electronics within. Now hopelessly destroyed, Karen stared at the wreckage of her phone, as if she were looking at the remains of her firstborn child. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, no sound emerging except for a strangled whimpering that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. The crowd, which had been holding its breath in anticipation, erupted into a mixture of gasps, cheers, and nervous laughter. "Bloody hell!" shouted a British teenager, pumping his fist in the air. He actually did it. The Japanese tourists began photographing the broken phone with the dedication of crime scene investigators, their cameras clicking rapidly as they documented every angle of the destruction. The Italian couple exchanged satisfied nods, the wife muttering something that sounded distinctly like "finally, justice." Guard Morrison returned to his position with the same mechanical precision he had displayed when destroying the phone. His rifle resumed its proper position, his eyes returned to their fixed point in the distance, and his face settled back into its mask of professional indifference. To anyone just arriving at the scene, it would appear as though nothing had happened at all, except for the sobbing woman and the pile of electronic debris at his feet. Karen's breakdown began with a sound that could only be described as the wail of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered along with her phone. She dropped to her knees beside the wreckage, her designer dress spreading around her like a collapsed parachute, her perfectly manicured hands hovering over the broken pieces, as if she could somehow will them back together through sheer force of entitlement. "My phone," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Do you have any idea how much that cost? Do you know what you've done?" She looked up at Guard Morrison with the kind of rage typically reserved for war criminals and people who talk during movies. "I'm going to sue you. I'm going to sue this entire country. I'm going to call my lawyer. I'm going to call the embassy. I'm going to call." It was at this moment that Karen realized the full scope of her predicament. Without her phone, she couldn't call anyone. The device that had been her lifeline to the world, her connection to her followers, her tool for demanding service and documenting her importance, was now nothing more than expensive garbage. Scattered across the stones of Buckingham Palace, the crowd's reaction was split between those who felt genuine sympathy for another human being's distress and those who believed that karma had finally caught up with an insufferable person. A small child, perhaps 5 years old, tugged on his mother's coat. "Mummy," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard, "why is that lady crying? Did she do something naughty?" His mother, a sensible-looking woman with kind eyes, knelt down to his level. "Yes, sweetheart. She was very rude to the guard, and now she's learning that actions have consequences. Meanwhile, several tourists had begun filming Karen's meltdown with their own phones, creating a delicious irony that was lost on no one except Karen herself. The woman who had been so desperate to document her own importance was now being documented in her moment of complete humiliation. The sound of approaching sirens cut through Karen's wailing like a knife through butter. Two Metropolitan Police officers, their high-visibility vests bright against the grey London morning, pushed through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had seen it all before. The taller of the two, Constable Williams, had been dealing with tourist incidents at royal sites for over a decade. His partner, Constable Davies, was newer to the beat but had quickly learned that entitled tourists were among the most challenging aspects of London police work. Right then, Constable Williams said, his Welsh accent lending a musical quality to his authoritative tone, "What's all this about?" He looked from the still sobbing Karen to the impassive guard, to the scattered remains of the phone, piecing together the situation with the speed of someone who had dealt with similar scenarios dozens of times before. Guard Morrison, without breaking his stance or moving his eyes from their fixed position, spoke in a clear, professional voice. "Sir, this individual violated royal protocol by crossing the security barrier, making physical contact with my person, and attempting to interfere with my duties. When she refused to comply with verbal warnings, I neutralized the security threat posed by her recording device." The crowd murmured appreciatively at this clinical description of events. Several people shouted out their own versions of what had happened, each account painting Karen in an increasingly unflattering light. "She was horrible to him," called out an elderly woman with a thick Yorkshire accent, "completely disrespectful. She grabbed his uniform," added the American couple from Texas, their shame at their countrywoman's behavior evident in their voices. Constable Davies approached Karen, who was still kneeling beside her destroyed phone, like a mourner at a graveside. "Ma'am, I need you to stand up, please. We need to have a word." Karen looked up at him with mascara-streaked cheeks and wild eyes. "Officer, thank God you're here. This barbarian destroyed my property. I want him arrested. I want him charged. I want—" "Ma'am," Constable Williams interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind, "you're going to need to come with us." The perp-walk, as it would later be called on social media, was a masterpiece of public humiliation. Karen, flanked by the two officers, was escorted through the crowd of tourists who had gathered to witness her downfall. Every step was documented by dozens of phones, every sob and protest captured for posterity and immediate upload to various social media platforms. "This is a violation of my rights," she screamed as they guided her toward their patrol car. "I'm an American citizen. I have diplomatic immunity." Constable Davies couldn't help but suppress a small smile. "Ma'am, diplomatic immunity doesn't work that way, and being American doesn't give you the right to harass our guards." The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that echoed off the palace walls. Someone started a chant of Rule Britannia, and others joined in, their voices rising in a patriotic chorus that seemed to celebrate both their guards and their national dignity. As Karen was helped into the back of the police car, still protesting her innocence and demanding to speak to managers, ambassadors, and anyone else who might restore her sense of superiority, the crowd began to disperse. But the story was far from over. Already, the first videos were appearing on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Someone had created a hashtag #KarenVsTheGuard, and it was beginning to trend. The guard, throughout this entire spectacle, had never moved from his position. As the police car pulled away with its wailing cargo, he continued to stand at attention, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his duty unchanged by the chaos that had briefly erupted around him. To him, this was just another day at the office, a day that had included neutralizing a minor security threat and maintaining the dignity of his post. A small girl, perhaps 8 years old, approached the barrier where Karen's phone still lay. In pieces, she looked up at the guard with wide, curious eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Guard," she said in a voice clear as a bell. "That lady was being very mean to you." By evening, Karen Whitmore had become the most famous person she had ever wanted to be, but for all the wrong reasons. Her meltdown at Buckingham Palace had been viewed millions of times across various platforms. Memes featuring her tear-streaked, face beside images of her destroyed phone flooded social media. Late-night talk show hosts were already writing jokes about the incident. News outlets from around the world picked up the story, each adding their own cultural perspective to the tale of American entitlement meeting British stoicism. In her holding cell at the local police station, Karen sat on a narrow bench, still trying to process what had happened to her carefully constructed world. Without her phone, she felt completely disconnected from reality. She couldn't check her Instagram, couldn't post updates, couldn't even call for help. The silence was deafening. The charges against her, while not severe, were embarrassing, disturbing. The peace violation of royal protocol and harassment of a public official. She would be released with a warning and a fine, but the real punishment was already being served by the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, the evening shift of guards had taken their positions. The broken phone had been swept away, the barriers had been straightened, and normal operations had resumed. Tour guides were already incorporating the morning's events into their spiel, describing to wide-eyed tourists how the guards maintained their discipline even under the most trying circumstances. Guard Morrison, now off duty, sat in the guards' break room with his colleagues, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. His sergeant had commended him for his restraint and professionalism, noting that his response had been measured and appropriate to the threat level. "Think she learned her lesson?" asked one of his fellow guards, nodding toward a tablet displaying the viral videos of Karen's breakdown. Morrison considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "People like that don't learn lessons. They just find new ways to blame others for their problems." As night fell over London, the city returned to its normal rhythm. The palace guards continued their eternal watch. The tourists continued their pilgrimages, and somewhere in a hotel room, Karen Whitmore sat with a new phone, hastily purchased and far inferior to her beloved rose gold model, staring at the videos of her own humiliation and wondering how her quest for the perfect selfie had turned into a perfect storm of public shame. The story would be told and retold for years to come, becoming part of the folklore that surrounds the Royal Guards and their unshakable dedication to duty. And every time a tourist approached the barriers with their phone raised and entitlement gleaming in their eyes, they would remember the cautionary tale of Karen Whitmore, the woman who learned that some traditions are sacred, some boundaries are absolute, and some guards simply don't give a damn about your Instagram followers.